Hello and welcome. My name is Hugo Currie and I'm a Year 12 high school student at the Riverina Anglican College in Wagga Wagga, Australia. This is a series of brief interviews with some of the most amazing physicists from around the world. I'm passionate about physics and will pursue a career in physics and engineering, so I'm honoured to be able to ask a few questions of some inspirational physicists. I really want to thank them all for generously taking the time to chat and, importantly, to pass on their rich insights. Hopefully other students with an aptitude for physics can take inspiration and guidance from experience and insights to shape the next generation of physicists. Today we'll be talking to Professor Rand Klein. Professor Klein is an imaging physicist at the Ottawa Hospital and University of Ottawa. He is also a professor in engineering and physics at Carleton University in Canada. Klein has more than 100 journal publications for research in image quantitation and computer-aided diagnosis. He has a degree in computer engineering, master's degree in electrical engineering, and a PhD in medical physics applications. Thanks, Rand, for taking the time to share your thoughts and experiences.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All good. So firstly, what drew you to a career in physics and what excites you about physics?
Yeah, so I never planned to get into physics per se. But it is serendipitous. So when I was in high school, I got into this really nerdy program. So, I spent 4 years of my life with a bunch of geeks, and I did my high school in Israel. So in Israel, they have this credit system. I don't know the exact numbers, but I think it's typical for a student to finish with something like 20, 25 credits. We all did like 35, 40 credits. And when I reflect back, very little of it was work. It was mostly fun. The extra courses we did were all electrical engineering, computer science. Physics was my favorite, by far my favorite. But my perception of physics was pretty skewed at the time. So I thought as physics as a pure science, it's people in a lab. And that's not what I wanted to do. I'm an engineer, I like to see problems, I like to solve problems. So long story short is that I wound up doing my undergrad in computer engineering. And during that time, in Canada, we have, that's where I did my undergrad, we have this co-op program. So every once in a while, every few semesters, we go and we get a job, essentially. And my first job, and I can still remember it completely vividly, I was sitting across from Dr. DeCamp from the Heart Institute. And it was like at the end of this half-hour interview, we just looked at each other and it's like, okay, like clearly we hit it off, like this is gonna go down. And so I did my first co-op with Rob, and then I dropped out of the co-op program and I just kept working for him part-time throughout my undergrad. So Rob was at the Heart Institute working in the domain of PET imaging for cardiac applications. Now, for those of you who don't know, PET is a nuclear medicine modality. When I started in the early 2000s, it was relatively new modality. Still, it's in infancy. And we started this research that had to do with quantifying blood flow to the heart. So we had a long established practice of imaging the heart for blood flow, but you couldn't really quantify it. So you didn't know like how much flow was going to the heart. And that's what we started working on. And it's through that research that I got pulled more and more into what is now physics. But today in the disciplines, the lines are very, very blurry, right? So even though I'm an engineer by training, my title says physicist, and the distinction isn't really obvious.
Yeah. So what do you see on the horizon for physics or engineering that would inspire the next generation?
Yeah, so physics, I think, has evolved a lot. Like we still do experiments, but the experiments today they're big, like Large Hadron Collider, Legos, like NASA. that's where a lot of the breakthroughs in physics today are happening. And as a result, it's no longer a man in a lab, like that image of the scientist with the lab coat. It's not really like that anymore. Today, the image is more of like a team of, it can be a few people, it can be thousands of people, it can be a bunch of nations getting together. And so there's still theory, and there's still a lot of the things that you kind of think of when it comes to physics, but really what's driving it a lot today is data. Data is the key word, right? And as a result, you see physicists doing a lot of computer data science, machine learning, these hypes that you hear about in Silicon Valley and all that, like they're definitely embedding themselves in physics as well. So that's kind of where things are going. But physics as a discipline, it still has some really fundamental questions and key ideas. And as a discipline, it's still going to remain a pure science that is going to drive what's probably going to be our biggest innovations in the future.
Yeah, yeah. I've noticed that as well, looking at university degrees and whatnot. In the last year, or a few years, data science has really kind of come out of nowhere in Australian universities as a degree, or as more of an option. And so I think I've noticed that as well, that it's becoming more relevant, I guess.
Yeah, I would really push a lot of the next generation to start embracing the computer as a real tool. And I mean more than just like, being familiar with Facebook and clicking on web pages. It's speaking the computer's language is very important, because just like English today is an essential language for doing high impact science, being able to speak to a computer, I think, is becoming just as important.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a universal language too, isn't it?
It is. The basics of it definitely are. They apply from one language to another, but
Yeah,
it's for for somebody of my age, and I'm like mid-career, not even that old. There are new languages, and it's kind of like daunting. It's like, do I learn Python now, or
yeah,
is it worth the effort?
yeah, yeah, exactly.
But yeah, the concepts do apply, and I really encourage anyone, almost in any discipline, like, at least get familiar with the concepts
Yeah,
of how a computer works under the hood.
yeah. So what skills have you relied on most throughout your career?
You got to be adaptable. You got to learn. Um, I just finished a defense, reviewing somebody's defense today, and they mentioned something about looking forward to a break from learning, and it's like, whoa, 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 like, you're so far away from being done learning. Like, I'm still learning, which is kind of nice, like I laugh that I get paid a pretty handsome salary to be a student, whereas most students, they pay money to be a student. So learning is really important. The other one is that as you become more advanced in your career, a lot of us move on to become managers. And so the interpersonal skills, that's really essential. It's I spoke about, the typical nerd, right? Which is where I came from. And, amongst us, we get along really well, but, when we leave our bubble, we're kind of uncomfortable. But you have to realize that that's a real limitation, because there's going to come a point where you won't have a choice. You have to interact with other people. You have to manipulate them, in quotes, to get on board with your ideas and your direction. And so those interpersonal skills, they're really worth fostering. It's no matter how geeky you are, you can only sit in front of a computer for so long, and eventually you have to talk to real people. The other one that is, I find people with my background underestimate, is communication skills. So, in science, everybody talks about the research and the exciting findings and so on. But the only way we find out about these exciting findings is because they're communicated outward of the lab, right? And so, the English teacher that you're kind of like, yeah, well, it's English, it's not really that important. At this point in my life, I know to reflect back and say that's not the case, like you need to be able to not only speak like we are now, but your written communication also has to be very good. And admittedly, I think that your generation is somewhat disadvantaged because your habits are to communicate in short spurts through text and Facebook and whatever new up and coming platform is coming. But to really sit down and write like an essay from beginning to end that sells an idea, develops the idea, that's really essential. And I really encourage everyone to develop those skills. Otherwise, you don't get listened to. I mean, not by the masses.
Yeah. So you've had such an amazing career. I'm interested to know what's been the highlight for you.
Yeah. So I'll answer that in two ways, right? Because people often look at the highlight as kind of like the pinnacle, the success that gets celebrated and all that. And I mean, that's easy. Like we all want to succeed, right? But there's a journey to get there. And I think very often we're not good at celebrating the journey, right? The challenges that come along the way. The period that I probably look back on with the most fondness was probably my master's career. I spent a year and a half in a dungeon of a lab, and I was working really, really, really by myself. Like literally, like if I would have keeled over and died in the lab, like nobody would have found me until the next day. But I loved what I did. I really I wasn't getting paid or very little, like enough to cover rent, but not much more than that. I was working like easily 14, 16 hours days. I'd come in on the weekend of my own accord. I really loved what I did. It was a project that, my supervisor just had to kind of mention the idea to me, and it was like all in, like no questions asked, I'm going to get this done. That project ended up to be really successful, so I think it's really defined my career. But I don't want you to misunderstand that it's because of the success that I see it as the highlight. That's not it. I really found something that I really, really, really wanted to do. And in hindsight, it's not like even I was so good at it, I was okay, but I wasn't like, I didn't come into it knowing exactly what had to be done, but it was just fun. It was just fun. So I learned everything I had to learn. So, to get a little bit more specific, pretty much what was described to me was that we want you to develop this rubidium elution system. So in cardiac imaging, there's this tracer called rubidium-82. It gets magically generated in a generator. So through radioactive decay, we load it with strontium-82, and strontium-82 decays into rubidium-82. And so rubidium-82 has a very short half-life. It's only 76 seconds. So, if you kind of like eluted it off the generator and, put it in a vial and measured it and then injected it to the patient, in the time you would do that, you'd lose most of your activity, right? And with the activity is the signal that we measure. So we need the activity there. So I was asked to build a device that would inject this eluate directly into the patient. So it was already a medical device, like, it was already like, what? Like, I'm gonna control a system that's going to like be electronic. It's gonna have an IV that connects to the patient, and I'm gonna have a computer system that monitors this thing and controls it. And so, that was kind of cool in itself. But then it had kind of everything that I like. So I was not one of those people that in high school was like, hey, this is what I want to be when I grow up. I kind of like everything. That's my problem. And so it had electrical engineering. I had to build circuits. It had computer programming. It had mechanical engineering. I was down there with a jigsaw, with like shrapnel of steel metal flying all over the lab. Loved it. And then of course the success did come with that, like I said. So by the time I was finishing up my master's, we had it certified from an electrical safety point of view. We started using it in the clinic. So we had like real patients being hooked up to this thing. I was in the clinic, right? So it's like I'd be right there and they'd be like, Ron, your machine crashed. And I'd go in there and I'd patch the code and I'd like, okay, next patient, good enough. And then, of course, we patented it, we commercialized it through an industry partner. I got to be like a consultant for that business partner, right? Which is a really nice feeling too, that you kind of get brought in only when you're needed as like the expert to solve the problems that nobody else can figure out. It's a great feeling.
Yeah.
Um, and then that project just had longevity that defined my career for another 10 years after that.
Nice. Yeah. I like that perspective of the highlight of the career. And even in like a niche setting such as my school, say a student gets like an exemplary mark at their final HSC, like their final mark for all of school. People celebrate the mark, but they don't celebrate the relationships with the teachers. They don't celebrate the hard work and the skills, like the learning skills that they've built. So the different ways they've learned to learn and what they've learned about themselves learning. And so I think I really like that perspective about finding the highlight. It's not just the end result, it's how you got there and what you enjoyed along the way.
So I'd like to reflect on that a little bit, Hugo. One of the things I thought, when I was a student was like, well, eventually you're going to go to the real world and your employer is going to want you to do a job, right? And it's like they don't care about your hardships; they just want a product, right? And that may be true in some places. I can't say. My experience isn't infinite. But what I'm finding more and more in academia, in healthcare, that's not really true, actually. People do actually care about your hardships as well, right? Like, so when I apply for a research grant, like there's a section in there where I talk about setbacks in my career, right? I had a child, that's a setback in my career versus somebody who didn't have a child.
Yep.
And, if I'm the mother and I'm supposed to nurse that child and take care of that child, well, that should be recognized, right? That additional hardship. If I'm taking care of an ailing parent, right? Like, and I think that is important. I'm not the only one that says this. As a society, I think we do see that people succeed and their success has to be measured not only based on the final product, but also what they had to be up against.
Yeah.
And so, I would tell, I myself am dyslexic, it's hard for me to read. I have terrible writing. Like I remember studying for my comprehensive exams and having to go through my notes from my undergrad. And I think that's when I discovered I was dyslexic. I mean, the writing mistakes were unbelievable, but you overcome, and you shouldn't brush the things under the table. You should take credit for it. You should get credit for it, that despite those hardships, you still managed to do something meaningful with your life.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. So is there anything in physics that is important or contentious that you would like to see the next generation of physicists work on?
Yeah, so I'm not a pure physicist, right? So I don't know everything that's happening. The topics that to me look really exciting and are going to influence society potentially in the next decade, 2 decades, right? So within our lifetime. I think quantum computing is really exciting. Like the potentials there are tremendous, because there are so many problems that are really hard for us to do with traditional computing, right? So I don't know if you know this, right? But like there are server farms today that require as much energy as a city, as a small city, right? And so when you imagine like people, mining for Bitcoin as a popular example, right? And then that mining is powered by burning of coal, you're kind of like, we're like wrecking the planet for what?
Yeah.
um, but quantum computer fundamentally changes the way we solve problems,
Yeah.
and can have really dramatic um, implications for society. Of course, like with every science, it depends what we do with it. Some of it can be for the good, and some of it can be for the bad. But I mean, that's for us to decide. The other one that I find really interesting is entanglement, particle entanglement, and the prospects that it can do for long distance communications, secure communication, even things like remote elections, where it's like when you cast your vote, only one person can read that vote. And if anybody interferes along the way, the
Yeah.
message gets destroyed, right? That's pretty cool stuff. So
Yeah.
encryption and communication, I think that's really neat. And I've never heard anybody talk about it, but in the domain of PET imaging, which I work in, we our business is to detect pairs of photons that are created simultaneously, and by definition they're entangled, right? And so it's actually will be really interesting to see as the technology develops if there is a way to actually measure that entanglement, know that two photons are entangled, which could actually result in higher quality medical images than are presently possible.
Yeah. Yeah. That is cool. Yeah.
That's really the amazing thing about physics or science as a whole, is that you have these concepts that they start off as like theoretical thought games maybe, but once they become reality, the implication on society can be really really provocative, and that's, I think the example that's very commonly given is lasers, right? Like in the 1920s, the concept of lasers was like a toy, but can you imagine society today without lasers?
Yeah. It's crazy. Yeah. No, that is very interesting. I for a maths assignment that I did a couple months ago now, I was looking at so they used artificial intelligence in the diagnosis um of like when they're interpreting the scans from nuke med scans.
That's
And
right.
so I was looking at a mathematical the Fourier transform, which is like an old mathematical thing that's used in signal processing and that sort of thing. And I was looking at it. We coded it up and it into artificial intelligence. And instead of having like a big convolutional neural network, it was just Fourier series straight into a neural network. And I think it was something like 5 times faster to process the images and produce the results with the same accuracy. And then it's a lot easier for filtering the images, so it can make it clearer and then identify specific regions. So I just thought that was really awesome. Like I really enjoyed it, looking at the applications of it and then piecing things together.
That's really neat. And like I don't know that that's much talked about in the scientific literature. You might be onto something that's really interesting. Um, and your teachers did a really good job there, right? So right now, like AI, machine learning, it's a huge hype. Like everybody and their sister are getting together and throwing their data at AI, and they're hoping for magic and unicorns to come out at the other end. Um, but it doesn't really work that way, So like we're building on like centuries of good science, good mathematical models that really give us insight. And the Fourier transform is a fantastic example, actually. And I've seen that in action. So I was in this class, I was auditing this class at the university, and the prof broke everybody up into teams. There were like 40 teams, and they were given a data set, and they had to classify the data set into different groups. And everybody took the data and threw it into the blender and got varying degrees of results. And one team, they were funny. They were kind of cocky about it. They're like, we got 100% accuracy. It's like, what do you mean? Like 100%? Like we can classify everything exactly. It's like, how did you do it? Well, we did a Fourier transform, and then we did the machine learning, right? They were the only ones that thought of that. And that's exactly right, because the mathematical models that we use, they're a subset of models. Okay, like we in life, in everyday life, you use models all the time, and these models are a way to understand the world around us.
Yeah.
And so that's why we learn. That's why we build on the success of scientists before us, right? Because these models, we understand how they work. They're predictable. They're powerful. And my fear is that we're going to go through like 20 years where we're going to not emphasize these models as much as we should. I'm even afraid that some of them will get kind of forgotten because we're going to rely on the computer and AI to do their magic. And I feel that we're actually going to kind of lapse, and there will be kind of like a resurrection 20 years down the road where all of a sudden everybody's going to be like, hey, there's a model here by this guy Fourier, and it's like really useful. It makes things work so much better.
Yeah, that definitely is the possibility for AI, especially since you don't know what's really going on in the AI. You just put it in and get the result. I think there's just a lot of unknowns that can be forgotten in the process, I guess.
Yeah, and so that's kind of the field of my current research is more exactly along what you're talking about. And whereas I would say 5 years ago, radiologists would be like shaking in their boots that like AI is going to take over their jobs and they're going to be unemployed. Today we understand that it's far from that. Yeah, AI is going to trickle in. It's going to augment us. It's going to help us with very specific tasks. But we're a far cry away from having like what's called generalized intelligence, like a machine that can really rationalize, can be applied to a vast range of problems. They're very specific right now.
Yeah. So last question that I've got on the sheet here. Do you have any pearls or pitfalls to offer high school students that have an aptitude for physics?
Yeah, this is a good start, like really try to seek out what physicists do, what they can do, where they can contribute, okay? Because the stereotype of the physicist is quite inaccurate from my experience. And there can be a lot of very, very exciting careers. A lot of physicists actually that graduate today, they go to work for financial firms, modeling stock markets.
Yeah.
You don't think of that as a physicist. But on the other hand, take a chill pill. People that are, finishing high school, they're still young. It's okay to not know what you want to do. It really is. It's good to know what you like doing. It's good to know what you think you're passionate about and to pursue that and kind of brace yourself up for a long journey ahead and make that journey enjoyable. Okay, so it's like a road trip. Nobody gets into the car to do a road trip thinking only about where they're going to be 15 hours from now. No, like you enjoy the process of getting there. And so, I always looked at my career as like kind of stepping into a field. I never really saw that mountain in the distance that I knew I was going to walk towards that mountain. I always looked a few steps ahead and I kind of stepped in the direction where it looked like, well, maybe there is not a bog here, maybe this is a smooth trail, but I also stayed true to what I liked, right? So I had a short career in telecommunications. And while I did some great stuff and I have some great stories to tell about that, ultimately I felt that, being able to move some bits of data from one end of the world to the other just wasn't enough for me, like
Yeah.
we had a good handle on that, we're going to continue to have a good handle on that. I wanted to do something that was a bit more challenging, a bit different. And so every time you say yes to something, every time you take something on, you're actually saying no to a lot of other possibilities. And so I really encourage people to, slow down, not rush, like money comes, money goes, but you only live once, right? And so, it's okay to take a bit of time and seek out an option that really makes you go like, wow, this is cool. I really want to do this.
Yeah.
And then you're laughing. And then you're laughing. Then you're never working.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's good. It sounds like you've at least the part you're in now is like that for you of your career, that you're enjoying it. So that's what all I can aim for.
For the most part, I mean, you get torn a million different ways. I don't love every task that I do every day, and that's okay. That's why they call it work, and that's why we get compensated for our time. But so you should have some tolerance for things that maybe you don't enjoy doing, but you have to do, right? Not you can't party all the time, but overall, the big picture is that yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and try to surround yourself with like-minded people. If you're the only one in the room, that doesn't like being in front of a computer for 8 hours a day, that means something. Like don't you're not going to grow to love it, like take that into account. So maybe you don't want to be the kind of physicist that sits in front of a computer all day. Maybe you want to be the kind of physicist that is in the lab, doing experiments, playing with equipment. Maybe you want to do something that's more in the field, and physics is everywhere, like I've interacted with physicists that work in geology, so they're climbing around volcanoes and sticking electrodes in the side of volcanoes.
Yeah.
That's I appreciate that. I respect that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And like and it's not to all careers, like they're legitimate. There's something to be proud of. I tell a lot of people, like academia isn't for everyone, like we're in an age now where everybody goes to university, and that's a path. It's a path forward. It's not the only path, if you don't think that's for you, find something else. But but do something with your time. Make your life on earth meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Oh, thank you for such a rich insight into the world of medical physics. I really appreciate you taking the time to inspire the next generation of physicists and engineers, and I'm sure that those that listen will share my appreciation. It's been great chatting to you today.
Gladly. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's really fun to be able to talk to a younger generation and hopefully inspire.
Yeah.
But you have my contact information. I'm always happy to speak to younger people, help them see what's out there, what the possibilities are. We didn't speak much about like specifics of medical physics and what I do in the day to day. That's fine. But if somebody is keen and interested, I'm always happy to speak to people.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for that. Yeah. No, it's been good. Catching up 2 years ago at the conference in Los Angeles, I think that's when we met, and then it's catching up again now, which is good.
Yeah. So it's your dad really affords you unique opportunities, to be able to to come and see and get a feel for how things are. You
Yeah.
know, we do conferences. It's not the only thing we do. It's part of our lives. Um, but you know, I think many academics, such as myself, we're usually very happy to show people, you know, the facilities we work in. Harder now with COVID, you know, and all that. But I think anybody who's like, well, I think a career in medical physics might be for me, you know, like um, I really encourage you to just kind of do a Google search, see who's in your neck of the woods, and just drop them an email, pick up the phone. I think you'll be really surprised as to how many people are willing to, you know, throw the door wide open and let people in and show them their multi-million-dollar toys.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, we're quite distant from each other, but if you were in Ottawa, you say when, and I'll give you a tour.
Yeah, too easy. Thanks.